Alasdair, Gunn, and Burgo are going to introduce the Genspect gender framework. Alasdair was working as an academic when he met a group of parents of trans-identified boys, and as a result wrote a series of Quillette articles. He's a vice director of Genspect. Joe is a clinical psychologist and psychoanalyst and a writer and media commentator. As the clinical lead for Genspect's Beyond Trans program, he supervises other psychotherapists who work with gender stress. Joe is a member of the Kalani Group, the world's leading think tank for sex and gender. Welcome, Alasdair and Joe. We look forward to hearing what you have to say.
It's great to be here.
Okay, it looks as if we're going to Joe. We've got a problem with connection with Alasdair. Joe, go ahead and do the presentation as best you can.
Yeah, and hopefully he'll be back on in a moment. So you heard from my introduction who I am. I would like to add that I'm also a gay man and a father of a trans-identified child who has alienated herself from me. So I come to this space with a lot of personal connections. I've worked with gender in my practice for a long time. I focus in my practice now pretty much exclusively on gender, particularly with the young men, since the young women seem to be getting most of the attention these days. And at our recent conference in Denver, I gave a paper about my experience working with these young men. So my involvement with this particular initiative, the gender framework, dates back to last fall when WPATH released its Standards of Care 8. Alasdair will have more to say about that when we get him back. But at the time, I felt that WPATH had handed us this incredible opportunity because by deleting their ethics chapter and including a chapter on unique identity and eliminating pretty much all safeguarding concerns about age, they really discredited themselves as a reliable authority. And so I developed and circulating a document I suppose many of you have seen and signed, the Beyond WPATH Declaration, in which I set forth pretty much the reasons I just outlined about why this organization is no longer credible. And then it was really after our conference in Killarney that Alasdair and Stella were talking about it, and Alasdair really had the brainwave, which is that we needed to release an alternative document. One of the things that I don't know, some of you may have had the same experience. Whenever I'm criticizing the standards of care and talking to providers or physicians about it and explaining to them why this is unreliable, they will say to me, well, okay, then what? Where's your policy document? And we've had some, brief guidances through Genspect. We have, guidance for parents, for schools, for providers. But it was Alasdair's idea that we now release a comprehensive document, a gender framework that would stand as an alternative non-medicalized model to the Standards of Care 8. So that's how we got here. And now that Alasdair's back, I can let him pick up where he was about. Yeah, you go ahead.
I hope this does. Can everyone hear me now? I hope that everyone can hear me. Okay, Joe, I can see you nodding. I do apologize. I've got no idea what that was. It was a gremlin in the machine. Yeah, I'll pick up on that. I think part of what's important in it is there's a number of things. One of them is if we're telling different people different things and our emphasis is different, then that's not going to work. We need to be saying the same thing to teachers as we're saying to anyone, as gender clinicians, as politicians, which is we fundamentally don't believe that the correct way to deal with these feelings is medicalization. And we also know that social transition, so in the business of changing names and pronouns and so forth, can be certainly at a young age, can be a gateway to medical transition. And so transition has to be seen globally. And if we're saying, what we want is for teachers to understand that we're not giving them some piece of advice by saying something else elsewhere. It's a whole package that's really designed for anyone who's interested in this, that they can see that there are ways through this which are non-medical, um, and which are appropriate and thought out for the whole of society. So that's one point. And then another point to make about it is that if you look at WPATH, they're only interested really in the individual. We're not just. We are interested in individuals who are in distress about some kind of issue like this, but we're also interested in their families and not excluding their families. And there are particularly important family members, parents, particularly parents of children, but also parents of young adults. Nowadays, we are going to start to see young people who are children of individuals who've chosen to transition. So they're going to have their own story and experience, which we think has a place. So if you look at the way WPATH deals with things, it's very consumerist, it's very individualist, it's very much caveat emptor. You're buying a service almost. And we're trying to look at things in a much more holistic way by including family. And then there's a third group, which is everyone else in society. So what about girls who want to be able to win at school sports? If you're only considering the feelings and the mental health of one individual and the claims being made by that individual and trying to assess them, and you're not at anyone else's claims and whether they are worthy of an audience. So that's one of the things we're trying to do is also to make it integrated in the sense that we're trying to say we are thinking of everyone, um, or we are attempting to think of everyone, which is what WPATH should have been doing from the beginning. Um, so because my sound cut out there, I don't know exactly what Joe said, but when we started as an organisation, we were very much driven by parents who felt shut out of the decisions that their young children were making, including children in the home, with frankly collusion from teachers and often gender therapists and other professionals besides. And so while it expands beyond that, it's very much driven by the idea that the parent is the world expert in the child, and that we have to have a very high threshold in our society for accusing parents of endangering children. That's not something which should be done flippantly, and that is something which is accompanying this new culture of medicalization. So I would just add that. I don't know, Joe, what else? What did I miss?
Well, what I wanted to add was that there are two basic principles in the gender framework. One is that we reject gender identity ideology in full, and we do not believe that anyone is ever born in the wrong body, even though they may feel that way. With regard to gender identity ideology, we feel that tackling gender dysphoria in this environment isn't a matter of better psychotherapy alone, even better psychotherapy for the families and the patients alone. It's really a society-wide problem now, because this ideology really has, I think you all know this, has infiltrated institutions at every level of society. It's in schools, it's in medical professional organizations, it's in the law, it's in the government, it's everywhere. And so if we're going to treat gender dysphoria, if we're really going to help young people who are suffering, it's a society-wide treatment plan, because I don't know about you, I have this experience all the time when I'm working with an adolescent at the behest of his or her parents. It's very frustrating when I'm trying to get them to see something and so many important figures and so many trends in society are telling them just the opposite. It makes me feel pretty hopeless and helpless a lot of the time. So the gender framework is really about challenging gender ideology at every level of society. So there's, as Alasdair was saying, there's schools and there's parents and their interaction with schools and education. There's the law. There's society at large. It's just a huge issue that's going to take a full court press on every level of society. So, Alasdair.
Um, yeah, so it's quite it's quite an ambitious thing to do, and it's a strange thing to do because it's not as standards of care because we're moving away from that kind of medicalization. Um, so for context, I had an experience which lasted, it's difficult to say, a couple of years in adolescence, which is very difficult. You could call it dysphoria, but it was certainly involved some very unrealistic ideas. And it was not social contagion. It came from trauma in my own life, and it was just a traumatic response, that the collision of a bunch of really difficult things happening and puberty together created these very strange perceptions that I had about myself, including that I wouldn't grow, which is laughable because I'm 6'5", and was always tall. And so I had some quite odd ideas. I think what we're seeing now, a lot of it is social contagion, but a lot of it is also that child has probably already been there. Maybe it's now a very small minority of this, but that child has already been there, who's got some serious trauma to deal with. Putting this into, so when Joe talks about gender ideology and gender identity theory, the reality is that you can't start to give way on the idea of what makes you a man or a woman that separates it from biology. So if you look at the way we've constructed this framework, it really starts from reality. It starts from biology. What is, um, whether you like it or not, what is, and then from there we can move out to theories we have about what is, different theories we have about the identity and developments and so forth. And I think putting reality front and center is probably what makes this so different to WPATH standards of care ultimately, because WPATH standards of care, for those who don't know, have now declared that being a eunuch, for example, is a gender identity. And so this in itself is taken as justification for any kind of medicalization that would, what would you say, accommodate or facilitate that identity. So this is a very, very different model that isn't driven, we would argue, by care. It seems to be, it's certainly experimental, so that there's no evidence base, but our problem with it is far larger than the absence of an evidence base. The problem with it is the absence of care and the atomization. So only dealing with the young person, cutting out the family, alienating parents, weaponizing schools against parents, these kinds of things. That's, I think, one thing which makes it very, very different. In some ways, they're completely different because we are never going to issue a document saying this is how you should transition, because we don't think that this is the best way to deal with these feelings. So there will be people, if people want us to come out with guidelines that say, well, some people should transition, just fewer than now, I'm afraid they're definitely barking up the wrong tree. We still think that the best way to deal with this is by having a more expansive vision of what it is to be a man or a woman, but that's a very complicated thing to articulate. And we're living in a world where I think these young people need us to provide something which can be seen as coherent, as an alternative, and which comes from a place of compassion, because whether it's people who had some kind of issue in our own past, or whether it's parents whose kids are having this issue, or whether it's people who've detransitioned, there are many, many people, I think, who do have compassion for these young people, necessarily think that compassion means you're right.
Right. One of the things that I've written about and dealt with in my practice a lot is gender transition as an idealized cure for everything. And in chapter 2, the chapter on the psychology of dysphoria, we take a look at the statistics around which sort of people are overrepresented in the group of kids who transition. So there's an astonishing number of kids on the autism spectrum. I think it was at the Tavistock, it was something like 30 to 40% of the kids were on the spectrum. These are kids who have felt weird, unaccepted, they're social misfits, and identifying as trans allows them a way to gain social acceptance, to be celebrated as a hero, and to feel for the first time as if they belong. That's a solution to a problem. It's not a very good one. The same thing, the more disturbing one to me is that the number of same-sex attracted kids at the Tavistock, I think it's also around 40%. We know historically that in the population of kids who trans-identify, who feel as if they are the opposite sex, that 80% of those will desist by the time they go through puberty, and 80% of them will be same-sex attracted. So you all probably know from Hannah Barnes' book that, the joke about pretty soon there will be no gay people left at the Tavistock because they're all going to be transitioned. This is a deep concern to me. I think, for all of us. We deal with that in chapter 2 and talk, yeah, talk about alternate explanations, alternate approaches. But I think Alasdair's right, is that we need a more expansive idea of gender. And it seemed like for a long time when I was a younger man, that was the direction we were going. The whole free to be you and me thing, where, it was acceptable for boys to have more, quote, feminine interests and vice versa. And somehow we seem to have, we're caught up in this very regressive ideology now that says that if you're a boy and you like pink and dolls, that means you were a girl born in the wrong body. So we really need to challenge that ideology that's taken root. We need to get it out of the schools, and we need to go back to expanding the realm of what's possible for masculine and feminine, for boys and girls to express themselves without feeling that they have to medically alter their bodies to affirm their identity.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, yeah, so Joe and I are both gay men. So there's a point here which I think is relevant in different ways in every different country. And I'm not a Kiwi. So, I mean, perhaps part of today, I was about to say tonight from this side of the world, might be about thinking about this. But this whole concept of LGBT or LGBTQ or LGBTQI and so forth, there are real issues, I think, around whether you can have those who've transitioned or seek to transition represented by the same lobbying group as people who are same-sex attracted, so lesbian, gay, and bisexual people. We're increasingly seeing disturbing signs, whether it's, there is, for example, a young man, very young man, a boy who was transitioned by his parents, Kai Shepley, I believe, and Time Magazine Kid of the Year. The parents openly said, we tried to beat the gay out of him. And lo and behold, they discover that they have a transgender daughter. And in the dialect of WPATH, they then proceed to save their daughter's life by providing gender-affirming, life-saving care. That's not the way I'd put it. I would say the homophobes didn't want a child who they thought there was a good chance would grow up into a homosexual. And so interfered really very seriously in that child's development. But we're also seeing among young women in particular, a lot of young women who are identifying as trans, they're identifying as trans. We don't know exactly what the figures are, but they say, oh, I don't like the term lesbian, I don't like the term woman, I'm more comfortable thinking of myself as non-binary or as a man. And it's very, very difficult to distinguish this from straight up old-fashioned homophobia. That it's easier for them to pass without being mocked or belittled, or perhaps without feeling that way. So they're just denying their own natal sex. So this is very, very concerning, because these young people, if you have this message, well, young people know who they are. It's not necessarily the case that a young person would know if he or she was being subjected to unfair treatment. There are some minority classes you might belong to, or perhaps attributes you might have, which it might only become clear over the course of many years that you've been unfairly treated, or indeed that you've had a certain advantage. So it's quite dangerous saying to a young person, essentially, you can just pick. You're a female, you're attracted to women, but you can pick. There's a way that you can do that and be heterosexual. There's then, if you look at the issue of the LGBT, there's a huge lobbying interest here, and it's quite interesting. There was some research done in the United Kingdom which looked at, I believe it was Pink News. It's a website, and it just did a token frequency count for the number of mentions of gay, bi, lesbian, and trans. And over the years, over a very short number of years, I believe 4, trans went from 10% to 70. Now, these are real factors. There's a real thing about visibility. When the last time I went into my local city, I saw a large billboard advertising trans tape, which is used to bind the breasts, used by young who don't wish to appear to have breasts. Um, and it's not without some kind of physical consequences. And because we have not had so many young people using these kinds of devices on such a scale, we don't have cohort-based research. I don't see anything about lesbians which is in the same kind of scale and which is put out there by city councils or by advertising agencies or by political parties, perhaps. And so in every country, there seems to have been a different flavour of slowly sidelining the gay rights movement. Now, I mean, it's one thing to say, well, some people might not care about that, and that's absolutely fine. I do. I think that for gay people, you have to understand it's quite concerning for us because we're seeing almost a sales pitch put to young people. And when, of course, these surgeries are not provided for free, and these hormones are not free either. So in many ways, the word almost doesn't really belong there. So we're very concerned about that aspect of it, and there are increasing numbers of gay people who share those concerns.
You know, one misperception is that because we now have gay marriage, um, we live in this entirely enlightened society where being gay is fine. Um, that is not true in middle school. It's just as hard to be gay as it ever was, and you know, butch girls and camp boys are mercilessly ridiculed and teased. So if you offer them an out, you offer them this idea that they could have been born in the wrong body and they're actually trans. It's a way to escape from the shame and humiliation of being gay in a very intolerant world where norms are rigorously policed by their peers. So I don't, um, Alasdair and I are talking a lot about LGB issues, and it's not just because we're gay men. It's because this is at the heart of so much of it. Um, you know, when you think back on that statistic I mentioned earlier, that, you know, in the classic profile, 80% of the people who were gender dysphoric and who resolve their dysphoria are same-sex attracted. There's a huge percentage of gays and lesbians who are being persuaded not to accept themselves, but to, you know, undertake medical interventions to alter their body so that they will then become normal. It's a huge, huge issue, and I'm sure it's of concern to all of us.
Yeah, I think one thing we should definitely talk about is to talk about WPATH and SOC8. You know, I would encourage anyone listening to this to head on over to Reddit. And there's 2 Reddits that I would urge people to look at. One is MTF and the other is FTM. So you just type into your favorite search engine, Reddit MTF and Reddit FTM. I don't even think you need an account to look at it. It's all public. And you can see the kind of things that these young people are saying. It's very mixed. Some of them are, you know, very euphoric, to put it in their terms. I'm not sure that's quite the right word, but, you know, they're very pleased with their transition and they feel like it's given them a sense of agency. But there's a repeated problem in both of those communities, the male to female and the female to male, which is as soon as these young people start to have problems, as soon as they think, was I right to do this? Or they start to perceive things which are being said in their name by members of what they would consider their community, the trans community, and they perhaps they can be pretty brutally excommunicated. So one of the great traumas for detransitioners is that they've often lost the 2 things have slammed into them at the same time. On the one hand, they've realised that they've got that the body that they thought they were improving is in fact damaged in their judgment. And then secondly, they've lost all their friends. Words like traitor get thrown around. This is a very strange way to behave. I mean, if you think about cosmetic surgery, you wouldn't describe it would be difficult to see one person who had happily had cosmetic surgery calling another person who had decided it was a mistake a traitor. So when we talk about gender identity theory and gender ideology, the ideology, there is a greater cause. This community can tip into quite religious ways of thinking and religious kind of ways of speaking, and that is yet another factor which is deprioritizing the health of these young people's bodies, because they are concerned about maintaining their position in a community and so forth. And if you look at these Reddits, you'll see that there are some young people who are really clearly crying. You could call it a cry of distress, that they're really saying, "I'm not sure this is the right thing to do." And what's happened in these online communities is much as what's happened in certain classrooms and schools, which is that an environment has been created where you cannot challenge anyone. You cannot say, "I think you're wrong." Um, and so it's quite difficult to read through these testimonies, because very often you can see it's a clear cry for help from a young person saying, "I'm not sure that this is the right thing to do." And anyone who comes in and says, "Well, perhaps it's not, and maybe it's not possible to be born in the wrong body," is immediately just kicked out. You are violating community guidelines. So in many ways, they've created a community where it's very, very difficult to be reached. And this affirmative culture, we have to talk about the affirmative culture that goes beyond the clinicians, the idea of being clinically affirmative, to the idea of being an affirmative culture more generally, because actually it's normal to challenge young people and to say, what's the justification for that idea? So I think that, the affirmative model that we've gone up against that's the phrase that's used of this idea that gender clinicians should accept the sort of the internal testimony of the person in front of them as in and of itself justification for medicalizing, for embracing this identity and going down that road. But the affirmative model is broader than that. It's actually a way of being in our society.
Uh-oh. Do we lose Alasdair or what? Yeah, just carrying on. Uh, yeah, so I wanted to say something. Stella O'Malley, the director of Genspect, is fond of saying we're really good at criticizing evidence. We're really good at looking at these studies and pointing out what's wrong with them. And that had its place. SEGM, the Society for Evidence-Based Gender Medicine, has played a really central role in doing that, just superb work. But it really came time where we had to offer something else. Alasdair and I are just maybe giving you the impression that we're just critical, but this gender framework actually provides something else. So for instance, in the chapter on families and schools, I'm sure you all know how this ideology has permeated the education system and how it's now installed in schools' policies so that teachers are mandated to affirm a child's identity, and in many cases in the states anyway, to hide that fact from the parents. So we go through all the reasons why that's a bad idea. You should never marginalize the parents. The parents have always been part of any treatment plan for an adolescent disorder like eating disorders or self-harm. It's always recognized that the parents have to be brought in. But even beyond that, we set forth, we have as an appendix, we have a model schools policy developed by a group of Genspect parents on the East Coast over a long period of time in consultation with schools and educators to here's a substitute policy, you know, we disagree with the affirmation policy that's codified in your current principles. Here's something else. And, so it's not just criticizing, it's saying, here's a better way. We likewise have model legislation that could be put forward in a non-discriminatory, non-partisan way that would protect minor children from gender medicine. I'm a big believer, well, I don't think that any child should be given medical interventions, period. I testified in front of the Texas legislature for a bill that made affirmative medical care for minor children illegal. I believe pretty strongly about that. But we have, I lost my thought there for a moment, we have like a model bill in the appendix. Here's what it might look like if you were going to bring legislation to your country or your state that would protect minor children from affirmative medicine. So we're not just criticizing, we're also providing these alternative resources. I think it's really important that we come forward with a different plan so that people don't say, well, yeah, you're really good at knocking down the other side, but what do you got? Well, here's what we got, the gender framework.
Sorry, I hope everyone can hear me now. You can't plan for the Irish weather, but you can do lots of other meticulous planning, but you can't plan for the Irish weather. Okay, so it sounds like you've mentioned the fact that there's sort of model policies and model laws in there.
Exactly.
I guess we could talk. I think it's always worth talking about left and right in this very briefly, and I would just say about Genspect is that it's you're very welcome in Genspect as long as you're not far left or far right, but we don't need to say that because the far right don't want anything to do with us because we don't think there's anything wrong with being gay, and the far left don't want anything to do with us because we do think there's something wrong with transitioning. It's mystifying, it continues to be mystifying to me that it's the far left. Maybe this is the wrong frame to put it, and maybe this is a funny way to put it, who have gone along with this very corporate idea. But I think that varies by country, and maybe that there's a lot of difference to be had here. So we're a very non-partisan organisation. You can be of one party or another party, and as long as you agree with the overall mission, which is to say we want to provide an alternative to this medicalised model. So I think it's worth making that point because in a lot of countries, I think it has to be said, particularly in America, things are very divided, and there are a lot of people who think that this is a very conservative point of view. And Genspect is a place where I think a lot of different viewpoints can meet and mingle. And as long as we all agree on the overall ethos here and the overall objective, which is to provide this alternative, then we're very comfortable with that. I think there's been a lot of focus on politics in lots of countries, but I think there is a sense that some people have that the UK has done better, and in my view, in part, there's lots of reasons for that. Part of it is perhaps because people have started talking politics in a more real way and actually now have the confidence to go to their political representatives and say, this is a deal breaker for me. So I think that while politically non-aligned, it would be nice to think that these conversations were informing people's vote and they were giving people the confidence to go to whichever party, whichever representative, and to say, listen, you can actually support something which has been put together by professionals, which is coherent, which does care about the young person in question, but it also cares about a bunch of other factors, and you can stand behind that, and it's not a betrayal of these young people. It's, we recognize their feelings. Some of us had those feelings. So yeah, I think it's that's a nice way to position us, because I imagine there are all sorts of things about the politics of this in New Zealand, and then again differently in Australia, which I'm not going to understand. But I think we can share information internationally so that we can inform those debates in different countries.
Right, and even if our model policies are, tailored to the United States, for instance, currently, I think they're adaptable. They're all adaptable to the local political scene. I'm sure the schools policy will be very useful to anyone in New Zealand who's dealing with this in their schools, because you know the, it must be the same that gender ideology has come out of the education schools from the academy into the schools and has been codified in policies. So I think there are lots of resources that should be useful to people all over the world, not just in the United States or the UK.
Hmm. And there's an important point to make about law in this, which is a very interesting point, which is a lot of what's going on in different jurisdictions, whether it's an American state or whether it's an entire country, is it's very year zero. There's all these bits of legislation which redefine quite fundamental concepts, well, the fundamental concepts of man and woman in particular, which of course has huge implications for children. And one of the points we seek to make is that we don't need law on what is a man and what is a woman, because we have it. We have centuries of law, and then before we have custom going back many, many, many millennia. And we sit atop many millennia of developing customs and then latterly laws around the concept of what is a man and what is a woman. And we all know what the answer to those things is. And so part of our approach to law is actually a defense of existing law. It is not to suggest that we constantly need to add new definitions, but actually we're making a mockery of a lot of the laws that we have, and we're making our laws very confusing. The First Minister of Scotland, who and arguably over this issue, or certainly influenced by this issue, resigned because she accidentally thought herself into a position where there appeared to be in Scottish law, in her mind, three sexes: man, woman, and rapist. She was making an argument that there was three sexes in law in order to get herself out of a difficult political situation. So our section on law and policy is not just kind of saying, like, let's have some new ideas. It's, in the main, when you think about it philosophically at least, really saying we need to assert the validity of the ideas that we already have and not allow them to be subverted without public knowledge and without public consent. So in the Republic of Ireland, for example, this is a good example. It brings us back to the LGB and the T point. The same-sex marriage referendum, which passed, I believe, in 2015, I might be wrong on that, I might be a year out, snuck through self-ID being the idea that any particular space according to the way that you identify your gender rather than according to your natal sex. And there was very little public debate. The public debate was all around same-sex marriage, which passed, but there was no real understanding that this was going through at the same time. So it was kind of piggybacked on in a way. And this is the kind of thing where we have to be mindful of the laws that we've already got, and then within schools, within hospitals, the regulation that we've already got, because it's no good coming along and offering a new definition of man or woman and then not thinking, well, how does it apply to all of the regulatory body upon which we rest, as a hospital, as a university, as whatever it might be. So that's also kind of part of it, is that there needs to be coherent lawmaking, and that lawmakers cannot just, and people who create regulation cannot just create new things without being held accountable for how they affect the practices we already have in place. So I hope we've also been effective at kind of communicating that.
I think we were asked to leave some time at the end, like the last 15 minutes, for questions. Shall we open it up to questions, or do you want us to keep talking?
We do have some questions that have come in,
Great.
guys. the first theme that's coming through is factors like the correlation between gender dysphoria and autism, and wondering if you can say more about that. We've had a note from someone watching on that in parent groups they're connected with, almost all parents say their kids are autistic, not 30%. And another choir thinking that, again, this seems to be a strong correlation. Really interested to hear a little bit more about your own experience and thinking about that.
Well, I mean, I guess the question is, are we talking about some sort of correlation that actually autism and gender dysphoria are genuinely linked? Or are we saying that autistic kids who struggle with a set of issues are being presented with an explanation by the world around them that will account for and solve the problems that come with autism? I think it's the latter. I don't think that there's just some intrinsic link. I think autistic kids are very much out of touch with their bodies often. They're very often dissociated from their feelings. They're not good at social cues. They're not good at sexuality either. So the transgender solution is extremely appealing if you've been out of sorts and felt like a misfit your whole life. It just says, well, here it is. You're actually trans, and come on board, and we'll celebrate you. I think it's an intoxicating answer, and I can't imagine many kids resisting the appeal. I don't think there's an intrinsic connection, though. I could be wrong. Alasdair, do you have a thought about that? I don't have anything more to say in answer to that question, but if you want to put up another question, I'm glad to speak.
Yeah, this an interesting question about any tips on how to group together to defend existing laws. It is a fairly expensive and time-consuming effort that needs some specialist expertise. Any ideas on that? And hoping here that the Irish weather will let Alistair come in on this one.
Yeah. Until he comes back, I'll say I was working with a group of Genspect parents who hired a lobbyist in the state of Texas to advance several bills that they were concerned with. They hired people to draft them. They hired a lobbyist to promote them. They got sponsorship, and they were brought to committee. One of them passed. One of them didn't. But it's a very expensive proposition. It's hugely expensive, and fortunately, these are deeply committed parents who happen to have the financial resources. But getting a bill passed to challenge these ideologies and to challenge affirmative care, it requires a huge commitment and a lot of courage. I mean, and it's interesting because I know a lot of these parents, and they don't want to jeopardize their relationships with their children who are still caught up in a belief system. So they work behind the scenes, and don't use their real names. It's you have to be pretty brave to do this and to use your real name. I mean, I don't have anything left to lose. I think I can't be canceled, and um, my daughter has already kind of banished me from her life. But most people are still trying very hard to hold on to their relationships with their children. So, hiring professionals, lobbyists to help you get legislation passed, I think is one way to go. I don't know how it works in New Zealand, if that's even a thing. But like I said, it's very expensive, very time consuming. I can't tell you how many people testified repeatedly in front of legislative committees in Texas and how much money was spent. It was a lot. So other than that, I'm not familiar enough with your legal system to know how it would work there.
Thanks, Joe. Um, there's another point that's come through that relates to what you were saying, particularly early in the presentation, about the holistic approach of the gender framework and the fact that we're dealing with some whole of society issues. And the observation is that young women often have to deal with lecherous het men, which may be a good reason for appearing non-binary or trans. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about how you're seeing this wider social context in relation to the development of the gender framework.
Right. Well, just to pick up on that point you were making is I think you can't talk about any of this ideology and the explosion of trans cases without talking about pornography. And you can talk about it from the boys' perspective and how they're influenced by it. But I think more powerfully, it's these girls who are now exposed to pornography, really disturbing, graphic, violent pornography at an age where they're just completely unequipped to handle it. It's totally understandable to me that a young girl would be terrified by that and say, no thanks. You know, I don't want to be objectified. I don't want to be treated as a sex object by men in that way. I don't like the way men are looking at me now that I have breasts. I don't like the attention I'm getting. So, you know, count me out. I will become a boy so that I don't have to deal with that. Um, I think that there's a different dynamic going on with the boys. That's something I've been talking about in the paper I gave in Denver. I talked about that. There's a lot of people who will talk about autogynephilia and say that all of the trans activists are AGP men and it's all pornography driven. I don't think that's true. I think there's a lot of AGPs in the movement, but I don't think it's necessarily all driven by pornography. I think there's also, and this was the major thrust of my talk, is that I think we live in a moment, a cultural zeitgeist in when where masculinity and being a man, particularly being a white man, is the last thing anybody wants to be. Men, you know, masculinity is a pretty negative thing. And so I think boys don't see avenues for them to become men they can feel good about. And so they renounce their masculinity, they renounce their sexuality often, and they identify um, with women so that they can not become, they don't want to grow up to be an oppressor that everybody hates. So I think that the cultural influences are vast right now and complicated, and I don't think we've just begun to deal with them in the framework, but I think there's so much more to be said about it.
Thanks, Joe. Um, Both you and Alasdair have outlined very clearly for us why the gender framework is needed and why it's important. Are you able to give us a brief summary of the content, the policies, or the chapters in the gender framework?
Absolutely. It's pretty simple. It's a pretty simple structure. So it's divided into 5 chapters. Um, the first one is basically giving the contextual background, giving you everything you need to know about queer theory and gender ideology. That's part of it. Um, and then there's a chapter that there's a section of chapter 1 that deals with the reality of biological sex, that it's real, innate, and immutable. Um, that's the groundwork. Then chapter 2 is the psychology of gender dysphoria, and that looks at um, it looks at the evidence based for gender affirming care, and it really kind of takes it apart. Stephen Levine is a well-known psychiatrist, and he was the lead author on this section. I worked with him and Cynthia, um, Christina Buttons. Um, and it just sort of like takes apart all of the evidence for gender affirming care and shows that there really is no convincing evidence that it does anything, you know, and sometimes it's has very negative influences. And it also presents some of the alternative forms of dealing with psychotherapy other than the affirmative approach, including traditional psychotherapy, which we do advocate for. We're concerned about these so-called conversion therapy bans that are attempts to have traditional exploratory psychotherapy labeled as a conversion therapy because we're, quote, trying to talk people out of being trans. I don't need to explain it to y'all. It's a complete misrepresentation, and it's an effort to get transgender ideology and self-ID in through the back door. The third chapter deals with families and education. There's the first part of it deals with traditional family therapy for adolescent mental health issues, and a whole model of how that's been traditionally approached, and really advocates for a return to that model, that parents, rather than being sidelined, need to be included, and that a child with mental health issues is part of a system, often a symptom of something that's going on in the system, but certainly not a completely isolated actor that can be understood without reference to the rest of the family. The second part of that chapter deals with um, the interaction of parents with schools and school policies, and then, as I said, we offer some model guidance for what you might propose to your school district if you can challenge the existing policies. The fourth chapter is about society at large, and it explores this concept of inclusivity. That was Alasdair's idea, that throughout our history, we've had to balance the rights of one group over another, and how to be respectful to one group without trampling on the rights of another. So there are many examples in this chapter about how we can balance respect and concern for trans-identified people without trampling on the rights of women, for instance. It's a big concern for all of us, trans women in sports. That's just one example of the places it might come up. The final chapter is on law and policy, and as Alasdair was saying earlier, it's less an argument for new laws as a argument to return to and emphasize the existing laws and traditions that we've had for centuries in our cultures. There's a glossary of useful terms, and there are appendices that include the model policies and sample legislation that I made reference to earlier. That's the gender framework.
Thank you very much, Joe. We've had one question for clarification. What are AGPs?
AGP is the usual way we abbreviate autogynephilia, and I always, because I work with autogynephilia and write about it and think about it a lot, I always assume people know what it is, but it's actually an obscure sort of phenomenon. It is it's thought of as a fetish or a paraphilia where men are sexually aroused at the idea of themselves being women. Um, they used to be thought of as cross-dressers or transvestites, but it's a particular, yes, it's arousal at the idea of yourself being really the object of your own desire, because these men who struggle with it are all heterosexual. They're not homosexual. They're attracted to women, and they often are married to women. They often have had relationships with women, but this fantasy interferes with their being able to maintain these relationships, because they keep turning away from their significant others, their wives, their spouses, and inward to this fantasy of being a woman and being aroused by themselves alone, as if they don't really need anybody else. It's a complex and disturbing phenomenon. I work with it in my practice. I'd say it's kind of my specialty at this point. These men often get caught up in transgender ideology and then medically do transition to becoming women. Anyway, I hope that's probably more than you want to
Yes,
know about autogynephilia.
Joe, thank you. And thank you so much for joining us today. And Alistair, despite the Irish weather, it's been so good to have your expertise open our day's reflections on this. Thank you so much for introducing the gender framework.
You're really welcome, and thanks for having me, and have a great conference.